Welcome to Nerds at Church, a queer feminist podcast diving deep into faith, nerdery, and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss Spider-Man.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man.
And the story of Daniel 6, which is Daniel in the lion's den, does not come up in the lectionary. However, Daniel chapter 3, another well-known Daniel story, is one of the main passages for the Easter Vigil, so we will be linking to our episodes on the Easter Vigil in the episode description. And we do have a content warning for you. There is a brief mention of suicide during the Njinga Mbandi conversation, which is our second hero for today.
If you want more of our nerdy delights, become a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch and check out the episode description for any other links to references we make in this episode. Our overarching theme for this episode is with great power comes great responsibility. This is an iconic Spider-Man quote, and so we thought it would be a great one for this episode and for how we think about heroes, especially superheroes with superpowers. They tend to be ones who have a lot of power, and it's easy for that to be abused, and so thinking about how power is used responsibly.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I'd also like to take a moment, because later we'll be talking about Spider-Man and less about the people in his life. But the line, with great power comes great responsibility, actually comes from Spider-Man's Uncle Ben, not from Spider-Man himself. He's quoting his Uncle Ben.
Yep.
He is an important character. So, our first hero today is our biblical hero. And our biblical hero for today is Daniel. And so let's start talking about who Daniel is, because we're talking about Daniel the person, who is a main character in the first half of the book of Daniel in the Bible. The book and the person are two different things, as you might imagine, but they are connected. And the book of Daniel tells stories about Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are faithful Jews living in the time of the Babylonian exile, which is approximately in the 6th century BCE. And about their life under King Nebuchadnezzar's tyranny and then the following Persian emperors. The second half of the book of Daniel is apocalyptic literature, which is kind of a whole different genre. There are visions that Daniel is having, but it's not exactly the same like story time kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And historians disagree on whether Daniel was a historical person who actually existed or simply just serves as a means to tell the story of the Babylonian exile. Most of them are coming down pretty hard on the side of no, he probably didn't really exist. So there's a distinct chance that he didn't really exist himself as a person, but the exile itself is a historical event, and many people would have lived under similar circumstances. So it's likely that some of these stories were taken from actual history and came down as legends. Mm-hmm. And there are a few Daniels referenced elsewhere in the Bible, but it isn't super clear that this particular Daniel is the one that they're talking about, and in a couple of cases it's pretty obvious that they are not talking about this particular Daniel. So.
Gotcha. Also, the storytelling in the book of Daniel, for example, in Daniel 3, which we're not going into detail on for this episode, that storytelling is very much a oral tradition,
yes,
hype it up, hyperbolic type of thing. And so that lends itself well to this was a typification of the exiled Jewish person kind of situation instead of this specific person.
Yeah, while we are talking about Daniel the hero and not Daniel the book today, I do just want to point out I did get to do a sermon on Daniel chapter 3 last Lent and talk about how the book of Daniel is actually meant to be pretty funny because they are making fun of the Babylonians and later the Persians, and you're supposed to find the constant repetition ridiculous because that's how they're making fun of them. And so I like to imagine a Greek chorus in the background is singing all of those repeated phrases over and over and over again in, a high-pitched, ridiculous voice or something.
I love that.
So it helps to get the general sense of the story. These stories are supposed to be over the top and kind of wild. But going back to Daniel as a person, while Judaism does not consider Daniel to be a prophet of God, but rather was a learned and wise scholar, or a character who was a learned and wise scholar, depending on how you go with that, who was also an excellent moral example, Christianity and Islam both do call him a prophet, although they tend to say that he's not as huge a prophet as, say, Elijah or Jeremiah or some of the others.
You mean he might be a minor prophet?
Yes. exactly. But was still an adult during these stories.
Mm-hmm.
Not a child. Different kind of minor. And the stories about Daniel and his friends begin when they are given Babylonian names that they must use in Babylon's court. Daniel's Babylonian name is Belteshazzar. Something like that. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego actually are the Babylonian names that were given to the Jewish men Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. All of those are great names.
Mm-hmm.
And then the four of them refused to eat Babylonian meat, which was not butchered or prepared according to Jewish religious law. And so they essentially become vegetarian for the duration. And for their loyalty, God gives them abilities, wisdom, and possibly some magical abilities that are stronger than Nebuchadnezzar's greatest magicians. Nebuchadnezzar has two dreams during this section of the book. One that involves a statue with feet of clay, which is a phrase you might be familiar with, and one that's about a tree, and Daniel is the only one who can correctly interpret both of them. And then Nebuchadnezzar's son uses the holy vessels from the Jewish temple to serve a feast to his friends. And when that happens, a mysterious floating hand writes a message on the wall at the feast, and Daniel then interprets that message as well. And so Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon are conquered by Persia, and a guy named Darius is made the new king. Darius may not have actually existed in history either.
Also, we talked about Daniel last season, in season 4, when we were talking about astrology with Emily Ann Garcia. So we can also link to that episode.
Yeah, that's true. So Persia, generally speaking, treats the Jewish people better than Babylon had. Still not necessarily great, but, generally speaking, they had more rights. And Darius gives Daniel, in particular, a position of authority. Early on, others accuse Daniel of refusing to worship Darius as he was supposed to. Basically, they declared a month where you could only pray to Darius and not to any other gods, and Daniel broke that. And so Daniel gets thrown into a den of lions, but God saves his life, and Darius releases him after this display of power. He's very impressed. And so Daniel has a series of visions, the apocalyptic text that makes up the second half of the book of Daniel. They are pretty interesting, and there's a whole bunch of different theories about what they mean. We're not going into that because we're talking about Daniel as a person. And then also the Greek version of the book of Daniel contains some additional stories that aren't included in the Protestant Bible, which include the story of Susanna, who is awesome, by the way. That's content warning for attempted rape in that story, but also, she comes through as quite the heroine in her own right. Mm-hmm. The story of Bel and the Dragon, unfortunately not that kind of dragon.
Sad days.
And a extended telling of the story of Daniel's friends and the furnace.
Mm-hmm. Fun fact, I definitely thought that the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace was a bedtime story for a significant portion of my life. I understand that it is not, but definitely thought it was for a while there.
I mean, people read Bible stories to their children at bedtime sometimes. I don't know that I would pick that one.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean,
I don't know how it happened, but somewhere along the lines, that's what my head decided.
Remembering the stories that we've been told, especially from our generation, people thought were appropriate for children, like, oh my goodness, the Velveteen Rabbit, yikes. There's a whole bunch of really horrific things that people tell to children, so yeah, that's definitely on the list. But our Bible passage for this episode is Daniel 6, verses 10 through 28, which is the story of Daniel first being thrown into the lion's den and then how he survives, which the answer to that is, God. So, Did you have anything you'd like to share about?
I do think it's interesting the comparison between Daniel 6 and Daniel 3, because Daniel 3 is with Nebuchadnezzar and is also like, hey, everybody worship me / this statue I've erected.
Sure.
And Daniel doesn't do it and gets away with it with Nebuchadnezzar, and then does it again with Daniel 6 with King Darius.
Yeah.
But I just like that it's the lions. And also, fun fact, the lions are usually depicted as the ones with the manes, the big fluffy manes,
the boys,
which are mostly male lions. Although occasionally female lions will grow manes in really cool and queer things. But they are not the ones that typically do the hunting.
Right.
Usually the hunters are the female lions. Also, I saw literally yesterday, TikTok or something on a lion who saw its like former handler or something and just ran and tackled it like a giant cat. And I would just like to remind us all that lions are in fact giant cats.
They are.
But dangerous. Don't actually treat them that way. You will die.
No. People who fall into lion enclosures at zoos tend to die horribly. Please don't do that. Yes. And also, if you want to be entertained by lions, there are tons of videos on YouTube and the internet of lions basically being giant house cats and playing with all sorts of things like cats do. My personal favorite is watching the parents teaching the kittens how to hunt and how to pounce, because the kittens will pounce on the parents and the parents will pretend to be terrified and fall down like they're supposed to. And it's just absolutely adorable.
Which reminds me of course, The Lion King, which is a great also.
Absolutely. While we're comparing that whole Daniel 6 and Daniel 3 thing, I think it's interesting now that I think about it. God is shown as overcoming these obstacles for his chosen people in both of those stories. But, the furnace and the lions don't get destroyed. If the furnace had been destroyed, the furnace served the whole palace and possibly the whole town. That would have thrown everybody's lives into total disarray. And the lions don't get destroyed because they're just, they're just being themselves.
Yeah, their mouths just get shut.
They are God's beloved creatures too, like other cats who might do all sorts of unexpected things, like jump into my lap when they're not supposed to. And hi, Calvin. But yeah, I like that they don't get destroyed because the furnace would have ruined people's lives, and the lions didn't deserve anything for just, hanging out and being themselves. They probably didn't want to be there either.
It's true.
Calvin would like you all to know that you should take time out of your day for headbutts.
Solid. Bailey likes to let people know that as well. Also, what I think is really interesting, and I think it's in both. Okay, that one of the things that Daniel does and is really clear about is he says, even if I die, right? Even if the furnace kills me, the lions eat me, whatever, still my faithfulness to God is not dependent on staying alive. My faithfulness to God is faithfulness to God, whether or not I survive this. And I think that that's a really interesting and powerful witness. It's also tricky because under Roman persecution especially, there are a lot of Christians where it's like, do you tell the truth or do you not tell the truth to stay alive?
Yeah.
And we've had it some in the church today too with clergy when the church is harmful and queerphobic, right? Is lying about a morally corrupt document actually immoral, or does the immorality of the document itself negate any lying that we might do about that document? So there's this ethical dilemma that Daniel raises of to what extent is truthfulness faithfulness and to what extent is survival faithfulness. And sometimes we get really complicatedly caught up in those, but yeah. It's not a simple answer.
No.
Or binary. Anyway.
And so rarely are.
It's true.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
So what do we love about Daniel, and how does Daniel tie into today's theme? Well, whether or not Daniel actually existed, he is still an excellent example of being put in a difficult position for reasons beyond one's own control, and continuing to follow one's own moral compass despite obstacles, including the risk of one's life. And I really enjoy some of the stories that exist like this. Jane Eyre is another example that comes to mind. And I have to say, the other example that came to mind of someone following their own moral compass despite obstacles, I just want to say that the way that the MCU handled Captain America's issues with the Accords during the whole Civil War thing didn't go over all that great, because they never actually explained what was going on in his head or why he was doing this or whether he had actually read the entire document at any point. And so, that was unsatisfying. I can't speak to the comic book version because I haven't read it, because there's like 1 billion pages of that. But yeah,
fair.
That was less impressive.
Yeah. I also love, because I used to think that this was a children's bedtime story, so clearly I love the story of Daniel, especially with the fiery furnace, but I also really love the ways that Daniel in the Lion's Den has been depicted in art, and just the different ways that people choose to depict lions and humans side by side and not destroying each other or being destroyed.
Often the lions are just sort of hanging out, but I do enjoy the ones where the lions are basically giant kittens playing with Daniel.
Yeah, Those are my favorite ones. But also, like, part of the tie-in to today's theme is the great responsibility that when Daniel and his friends become vegetarian, right? They make a deal with Nebuchadnezzar at the time to say, we won't eat this meat. Give us a vegetarian diet. And Nebuchadnezzar says, okay, but you still have to do all the things. And they actually, like, exceed what others who are eating the meat do. And so there's this sense of, like, even as they are in exile, they are given this extra power and this extra responsibility, and they don't take it lightly.
Right.
They take seriously the power that they are given and take that responsibility and use it responsibly. And so I really like that as an example and tie-in for today's theme.
And I'd also point out that they're balancing an additional responsibility that we're not really counting by being vegetarian, because in ancient times they didn't have the understanding of nutrition that we do now. And so while poor people quite frequently didn't get to eat meat that often, they were still fairly regularly having, like, meat broth, basically, meat-based broth, and so that was providing certain types of nutrition. And so when God gives them the ability to thrive under a vegetarian diet, that's not nothing. That's important, because they didn't know how to substitute vegetarian foods the way that we know now.
Yeah. Yep.
And then for media about Daniel, obviously there are oodles of biblical commentaries. Many of them have been titled Daniel, creatively enough. Many of them are written by Jewish people. Many of them are written by Christian people. I have to imagine that some Muslim folks have written some as well. And there is an essay by previous podcast guest, Dr. Amy Jill Levine, in the New Oxford Annotated Bible with the Apocryphal Deuterocanonical Books, the New Revised Standard Version, which was published in 2010. She writes on Daniel there. And there was also a novel from the 70s by an author named E.L. Doctorow, which was called The Book of Daniel, which was then made into a TV series more recently. But that's not actually about this Daniel. It has nothing to do with the biblical Daniel. It's about a son of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who I think is fictional.
Ooh.
The son, not Julius and Ethel, obviously.
Okay. I was like, they're not fictional.
Yeah. And Daniel in the Lion's Den is the first Bible story that was ever told by VeggieTales, and it featured the songs "Oh No, What Are We Gonna Do?" and "Fear Not Daniel."
And this may have been the culprit for me thinking this was a children's bedtime story. The VeggieTales may have been the one.
I mean, yeah, a lot of stories in the Bible are portrayed for children. That's pretty common.
No, but, like, the VeggieTales might have been why I thought this was a
I didn't really grow up with VeggieTales, so
I did at church. In Sunday school sometimes. We'd have VeggieTales for Sunday school.
And then there are also a variety of TV episodes or movies or cartoons about the Bible story, several of which were made by right-wing Christian groups of, let's say, questionable production value and biblical scholarship. There are a ton of those. Like, if you search for Daniel, that is some of the very first stuff that will come up.
So be careful.
I haven't gone looking for them, but I saw a couple brief clips, and wow, that was some terrible acting. I hope those folks took some classes. Anyway, so, acting or biblical scholarship, or both, who knows. But
yeah, so be careful with what you do with that, especially because, in fact, Jesus is not in the book of Daniel.
Yeah, no.
Even I grew up with the fiery furnace and the, like, oh, look, it's Jesus. That's not Jesus, y'all. Jesus does not show up in the fiery furnace.
You know, I don't know why, but for some reason as a kid I always assumed that the fourth person in the furnace was Daniel. It seemed kind of obvious to me. I don't... that's weird.
That's fantastic. I had never thought about it that way. I don't think it's Daniel because the person, like, appears in there. But yeah. Just use your hermeneutic of suspicion with any commentaries that you get, especially Christian commentaries on the book of Daniel. Just be... Anyway, our second hero of this episode is Njinga Mbandi. And I'm super excited about her because I have learned a lot about her and she's just really cool. So she was born around 1582 as the eldest daughter of Mbandi a Angola Kiluanji, who was the king of Ndongo, which is present-day central Angola, and died December 17th, 1663. So she lived for 81 years, which is impressive in the 15 and 1600s. Some background to her time in the world is that the Portuguese forces were frequently attempting to invade Ndongo and enslave hundreds of thousands of Ndongo's people in either Portuguese Angola, the colony that they had created, or getting them into the transatlantic slave trade. So it is against this background that she was born and raised. And Njinga Mbandi had a lot of physical prowess, and so her dad, the king, had her train with the army, and she also had a lot of charisma, and so he also had her groomed for leadership. He had her sitting at court with him and learning the politics of rulership. And when her dad died in about 1617, her brother Njinga Mbandi became king, and the Portuguese kept putting pressure on him again and again and again, such that he moved the kingdom of Ndongo to the Kidonga Islands, and then he sent Njinga Mbandi to Luanda to negotiate a peace treaty with the Portuguese. And one of the practices that had been imposed in negotiations and interactions is that anyone who was from the continent of Africa would sit on the floor in front of the Portuguese, and Njinga Mbandi was like, hell nah. And so she refused to sit on the floor in front of João Correia de Sousa, who was the governor of Luanda, and instead she had a servant get on all fours, and she sat on the servant's back.
Assuming that's her servant, and
yes,
not the Portuguese servant.
Yes, one of her servants.
Because that would be a power move, but yeah.
That would be a power move. I'd be extra impressed about that. But no, one of her servants, and she sat on their back. And there's just like the way that she engaged in the peace treaty negotiations and stuff was just really impressive, that she just had such a great understanding of the politics and how to navigate all of that. She also, during that trip, agreed to be baptized, possibly to garner favor from the Portuguese, and she took the name Ana de Sousa. And whatever, all of the things that she did combined, she came away from those negotiations with a treaty. The Portuguese agreed to withdraw their forces and to assist Ndongo in pushing back mercenaries, which is awesome and surprising probably no one except for maybe some white people. That treaty didn't last very long. The Portuguese, as with any colonizer, weren't quite obligated to stick with their words. And so the peace treaty, while it lasted, was great and then didn't last very long. And Njinga Mbandi's brother, the king, died by suicide in 1622, which was later that same year that the treaty was negotiated. And he made Njinga the regent for his son, who was too young to rule on his own. And within 2 years, the son was killed. It's semi-mysterious, quite possibly she killed him. It's not super clear. But that also is how a lot of monarchy stuff happened back in the day. And when he died in 1624, then she became queen. This is where I think it gets the most interesting to me. But as queen, she continued to negotiate with the Portuguese, though was not as successful as she had been the first time. The Portuguese sided with dissidents who rejected Njinga's claim to the throne and supported Hari a Angola instead, because the Portuguese, as colonizers do, were very much like divide and conquer. As long as they could get everybody else fighting against each other, it would increase their power. And so even in the midst of struggling to maintain her own boundaries and her own borders for the kingdom of Ndongo, she also conquered neighboring kingdoms of Kidonga and Matamba in the mid-1630s. And ultimately partnered with the Dutch West India Company after they occupied Luanda. in 1641 in order to fend off and defeat the Portuguese, until ultimately losing out to the Portuguese in 1648 when reinforcements arrived from Brazil. Eventually, there was another peace treaty in 1657 in which the Portuguese recognized Njinga's claim to rule. It delineated her territory for the kingdom of Ndongo and disbanded the Imbangala, which are the warrior founders of the Kasanje kingdom, which is who the Portuguese were supporting and siding with against her. And it allowed Christian missionaries into the land. So if you had any doubts about if Christian missionaries and colonization went hand in hand, please stop doubting. They did. This is an example. This is not even our most local example, but this is an example. And so she did a lot in her time as ruler, and she set up her own plan of succession and continued to defend Ndongo against the Imbangala to the east of her, and ultimately after her death was succeeded by her sister Barbara. And so there's just this really cool, like, she set it up to go well, as opposed to like, I don't know, I'm gonna die and then this happened, and kind of throwing things into more chaos. She set it up really well because she knew the importance of, particularly when facing Portuguese colonization, right? The importance of clear leadership and clear succession of rule. Yeah, so she's really cool. And Njinga Mbandi is known for her ferocious stance against the imposition of Portuguese colonialism and the rejection of white European gender norms. So she kept concubines of all genders. She married multiple husbands. She dressed as a man and insisted on being referred to as a king and not a queen, which is all really cool. And I don't think we talk about that as much. We don't lift up the queerness and the gender and sexuality of her as a person and in her particular role as monarch. But it's really cool. It's always exciting as a queer person to come across people in history who are not following Western binary gender and sexuality norms.
Yeah.
Because it's a reminder that, like, yeah, we have always existed. In every culture, there's always some ways of expressing ourselves in terms of gender and sexuality that don't align with what has become the dominant gender binary. So she was involved in the slave trade. While she resisted it for her own people, her forces did take hundreds of thousands of captives in the course of their fighting, and so she ended up selling nearly 200,000 slaves to the Portuguese, both for Portuguese Angola and for the North Atlantic slave trade. And that's one of those, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And how do you wield that power? And she wielded it to protect her own people, sometimes at the expense of other people. But one of the cool things that I learned is that Afro-Brazilians descended from Angolan slaves celebrate her, and one of the ways they do that is by electing a king of Congo and Queen Njinga during Rio's Carnival. So that was really cool because I was like, okay, yeah, like, even as they are probably people that she may or may not have sold into slavery, but people that celebrate the ways that she resisted and that she pushed back against colonial powers and enslaving powers. And I really love that. I love that she used the power that she had and resisted the overwhelmingly powerful Portuguese slave trade to protect her people, no matter where she found herself, right? No matter where the kingdom got pushed to or back to, she did her best to use her power to protect her people. I would have loved for her to, protect more people, but I think she did a really good job of resisting the power of the Portuguese.
I also love that story of I'll just bring my own share.
Right. Yeah. Do you have anything else that you love?
She sounds amazing, and also this is another example of African history being erased by colonialism, and we could have so many more stories like this if people hadn't been steadily trying to destroy them for a very long time. Yeah.
I didn't learn meaningful African history until college, and even then it was not nearly what it could and should have been. But if you are curious and want to know more about Njinga Mbandi, we'll link to the article that I got a lot of this information from. It's a really great website that actually looks at all of the different peoples involved in the slave trade, particularly looking at the peoples who were kidnapped and enslaved. And so there's just a lot more of this history that we don't learn in school that you can learn there. But one of the books that has a lot of information, people have done dissertations on her, so you can like find those and PDFs and stuff. But Linda M. Haywood wrote Njinga of Angola, Africa's Warrior Queen, in 2017. There's also a PBS short video about her. It's less than 10 minutes long. And then the movie Njinga, Queen of Angola. And as with movies, take it with a grain of salt in terms of the historicity of it. But those all would be great ways to engage with Njinga Mbandi and the amazing history and the power that she wielded in her world. Yeah.
All right, and then our pop culture hero for today is Spider-Man. Yay!
Woohoo!
And Spider-Man first appeared in the Amazing Fantasy Anthology comic book in number 15 in 1962 as Peter Parker.
Mm-hmm. Before we get to it, Kay, who was your first Spider-Man? What was your first encounter of Spider-Man?
Well, I know I went to see the first Tobey Maguire movie in theaters when it came out.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I made opening night, but fairly quickly. But I was in college at the time. And I know that I knew who Spider-Man was before that. I probably saw a couple of cartoons over time. The cartoons that are known for being the really good ones were not on when I was a kid, or were not really available to me. So I was less impressed by Spider-Man until later on there were better depictions of him. But I knew Spider-Man was one of the guys in Marvel. So, how about you?
Yeah, I also saw Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man. That was probably my first real meaningful introduction to Spider-Man, similarly to you, right? Like, I knew of Spider-Man, probably had seen a couple of the cartoons, but was not really into Spider-Man until Tobey Maguire. I got pretty into it, and then there just have been so many different remakes of Spider-Man that I have lost touch with, because it just was like reiterating the same thing until Miles Morales and the Spider-Verse, and that kind of opened Spider-Man back up for me in terms of things I love and ways of engaging with Spider-Man. So many of the superheroes were just like cis-het white guys, and
again.
Yeah, it's just boring.
Yeah. I do actually have one of the Spider-Man video games on my Steam Deck, but I'm currently obsessed with a couple other ones, so I haven't gotten to it yet. But I'm looking forward to it. It sounds good.
That's fair. Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited about the Miles Morales stuff. It just is more exciting and more engaging because there's more to it. But back to the beginning. So the original Peter Benjamin Parker, a white teen boy who gets bitten by a special spider, often radioactive, often on a school field trip, and gains spider-related powers. The older versions of Peter had him becoming a freelance photographer for the Daily Bugle, which is part of the Spider-Man that I remember, which is a tabloid newspaper in New York run by J. Jonah Jameson. And Parker specialized in photos of Spider-Man, who Jameson hated, not because he was a mutant, but because he distrusted masked vigilantes. And the Bugle regularly had major stories about how supposedly terrible Spider-Man was. As time went on, the photographer gig became a way that Peter was paying for college as he got a science degree, and featured less in the more recent stories as Peter became a brilliant scientist. Peter Parker lived with his Aunt May as his parents and Uncle Ben died. Uncle Ben's death is one of the formative points in Peter Parker / Spider-Man's trajectory. And he dates both MJ and Gwen at various points in his timeline. Gwen, you might know from the Spider-Verse ones as Ghost Spider or Spider-Gwen. She's fantastic, even with the missing handprint of hair from Miles Morales. Miles Gonzalo Morales came about as an idea right around the time of Barack Obama's election, and thinking about how representation of superheroes and others makes a difference to folks. And so Miles Morales was created by Brian Michael Bendis and illustrated by Italian illustrator Sarah Pichelli. And he debuted in the 4th issue of Ultimate Fallout, which was released August 3rd, 2011. And Miles Morales is part of the Spider-Verse stuff. So he is from Earth 1610 and born and raised in Brooklyn to an African-American father and a Puerto Rican mother. And he was bit by a radioactive spider from a different Spider-Verse. And the Peter Parker in his Spider-Verse was killed, and he actually watched him die. And so Miles Morales, with some encouragement and some of the hubris of any teenager, takes on the moniker of Spider-Man. He is the first African-American, first Black Spider-Man, and the second Latino Spider-Man. And he doesn't have as strong of a Spidey sense as other Spider-Men, but he does have the bonus of camouflage, so he can basically become invisible, and Venom Strike, which temporarily paralyzes almost anyone with just a touch. Doesn't actually use venom, but that's just what it's called. And the movies that star Miles Morales really get into the Spider-Verse, and I love it. I love the different Spider-Verse versions, and you get all of these different types of Spider-Men, of Spider people. There's a Spider Pig, there's a Spider Robot, there's a black and white Spider person. And part of what I love is each Spider-Verse has a different artistic style. And so Spider-Gwen and Miles Morales and all of them have, like, when they show up in the movie, they have a different artistic style that comes with them. And so the ways that those intersect with each other and that sort of thing, it's just fantastic. I love it.
And it sounds like an example of why AI and comic books are a terrible combination, because AI wouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah, AI could never do that, for sure.
So, as Emily mentioned, there are other spider people, some of which come from other universes, some of which don't. But two of them that especially tend to be well known by folks are Venom, which is a spiderish parasite who had evil tendencies and sometimes tries to take over Spider-Man. Also, more recently, there's a guy named Eddie Brock that carries Venom around. It alternates between Venom being an actual problem and being a comedic bit, I think. And so that's kind of interesting. And then, of course, you also mentioned Spider-Gwen or Spider-Woman or Ghost Spider, depending on which continuity we're talking about. That gets complicated, as comic books do. But originally, she was known for being Peter Parker's girlfriend after he and MJ part ways, and Gwen later becomes a superhero in her own right and gains spider-related powers for various reasons. Also, sometimes she dies, and then, of course, she's not dead because this is comic books, and the only person who stays dead is Uncle Ben, except not really. So I hope that's clear as mud.
That's fantastic.
For years in comic books, the only rule was that anyone who dies can come back except for Uncle Ben. And then they finally broke that rule. So.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like we talked about with Pace, right? Where Superman dies. Yeah. That's fantastic. Also, there's a kids show version thing of Spidey and Friends, which has Miles Morales and has Gwen and has a kid Peter Parker, I think.
Nice. And
the Spidey Spider. I don't know which one's that's called. But.
This sounds like a Spider-Man version of Muppet Babies. Is that what we're going for? Or
I think it's kind of that. I know that my favorite 6-year-old loves them, and so I drew them for her Christmas card this year. Last year, so yeah.
Spider-Man also teams up with various other superheroes. A lot of the more local New York City superheroes frequently team up with him in various situations. Deadpool and Spider-Man have a ton and a half of fanfic about them. If you go to the Archive of Our Own, wow, it's hard to find a Deadpool story that doesn't feature Spider-Man. Often as a couple, but also sometimes as friends, or with Deadpool sort of taking on a mentor/protective role for Spider-Man. The idea of Deadpool being anyone's mentor is a little terrifying, and that's kind of the point, often. And then there's also what's known as Team Red, which is when Spider-Man, Daredevil, and Deadpool all sort of team up together for various reasons, again, usually for local New York City reasons. And they're often portrayed as a more semi-normal and somewhat more jaded group of superheroes than the Avengers are, as both Matt and Peter have actual day jobs, and they spend more time around ordinary people than the other superheroes do. And so it tends to be an interesting contrast of, the Avengers have no idea what the price of a gallon of milk is, and Peter and Matt are asking themselves, can I afford a gallon this week, or do I need to get a half gallon? Like, that's the life they live.
Yep.
And also Spider-Man does team up with the Avengers fairly regularly in various storylines, but Spider-Man is also known for continually refusing offers to join the Avengers, as then he would have to reveal his identity, and he doesn't want Aunt May to be in danger. Also sometimes other people, but it tends to focus heavily on him protecting Aunt May. And Spider-Man prefers to specialize in the less powerful villains, because he can handle them on his own, and he tends to stick more closely to New York City itself than a lot of the other superheroes do.
That tracks.
Although he's not quite as specific as Daredevil, who sticks to 10 square blocks in Hell's Kitchen. So.
I mean, but also he can, Daredevil is blind, so...
Well, yes, there's good reason that Daredevil does that, but yeah.
He knows that area well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what is Spider-Man known for?
Doing things a spider can.
One of the things that's really cool in the... Right? in the Spider-Verse movies is they retell the story over and over and over again, and so you get the these are the essential things. Spider-Man is bitten by a usually radioactive spider. Usually it's a spider. Someone close to them is killed by a bad guy, and someone they love hates Spider-Man, not knowing that they are in fact Spider-Man. And that's the general Spider-Man arc. Right? For Miles Morales, it's his uncle who is killed, and his dad who hates Spider-Man because he thinks that Spider-Man killed his brother. But it happens differently in different situations. The superpowers that tend to be attributed to Spider-Man are strength. He is generally stronger than your usual super soldier, like Captain America, as well as having really fast reflexes and agility and flexibility, resilience in terms of his body can take more hits, a genius level intellect, and that tends to be the case before he was ever bit by a spider. He's just a really super nerd. He has a spidey sense, and this varies, right? As I mentioned, Miles Morales' spidey sense is shortened so that it's really just I'm about to be in immediate danger, whereas others have a bigger spidey sense of being able to sense when danger is afoot a little bit farther off. And they can sling webs to get around a lot of the time.
Sometimes that's something that Peter makes for himself, and sometimes it's something that actually comes out of his body, and then he makes things that help that be more efficient. It varies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the ability to walk vertically up walls or from the ceiling, even through clothes, that he has little grabber thingies. And then, as we mentioned with Miles Morales, Miles has camouflage and venom strike. Not all of them do. Mm-hmm. And usually they do not have the ability to summon or talk to spiders, but there is a hilarious comic book moment where he pretends to in order to scare some criminals into surrendering themselves, and Spider-Man is clearly enjoying himself that way. There is also a Spidey spider who then gets in a robot and stuff. So from the basics, there's a lot of different shared things, but also diversity.
Also, Spider-Man tends to be a lot more snarky than the more serious superheroes, and he will absolutely throw around one-liners and insults during fights. And one of my favorite moments in the MCU was during Civil War when he asks Iron Man, have you ever seen that really old movie, The Empire Strikes Back? And he's not even trying to insult the guy at the time, and you can just see Robert Downey Jr. make a face of, I am so old, and it's amazing.
Yeah. Yep. Spider-Man's quips are quite delightful, and I love that. As I've mentioned, I love the Miles Morales Spider-Man version. I love the getting into the Spider-Verses and just such a rich diversity of who the Spideys can be and how they interact and how they are different from each other. And yeah, I highly recommend the Spider-Verse movies. But yeah. What do you love about Spider-Man?
From one inveterate smart aleck to another, I certainly do appreciate his constant one-liners and how he uses humor as a defense mechanism. But also, I really enjoy the other characters that Spider-Man tends to be around. I'm a little sad that the MCU hasn't embraced J. Jonah Jameson, because he was super interesting, because while he hated Spider-Man, he was also an interesting character in his own right, and had a whole backstory, and, like, you aren't supposed to hate him. He's actually a pretty decent guy. He just has a grudge against Spider-Man because he doesn't like masked vigilantes, which, like, in the real world, that makes perfect sense. Of course you shouldn't trust masked vigilantes. Spider-Man has to prove himself, but even then it's perfectly reasonable to have some distrust go in there. That's fine. Yeah. And so he just has a really interesting backstory, and I wish he'd show up more in the more recent stories. Yeah. And I don't know, like, I like the idea of Peter having an interest in science and being smart, but I don't think he needs to be the next Tony Stark, and I don't think that taking away the photography's life story from him was all that useful. I like the idea of him, having to have a job to get through college. And
I like that it was taking pictures and that he was, like, Spider-Man's main photographer.
Yeah, and that becomes
it just, like, was so perfect.
Yeah, because of course that's how he'd make money.
Yeah.
And I really like having a superhero that has to worry about how he's going to pay rent this month.
Yeah, agreed. So, tie into today's theme. Obviously, with great power comes great responsibility, comes from the Spider-Verse, from Uncle Ben. And one of the things that is interesting for all three of the heroes for today is this sense that none of them automatically were assumed to have all of this power. The closest is Njinga Mbandi, but even she was not the one who was assumed to become king. And so there is this sense of they received or gained or earned power at some point, and then it was, what do you do with it? Now that you have it, now that you've gotten it, what do you do with it? And I think that Spider-Man does a great job of digging into that. I think Miles Morales does a great job because he does the teenagery thing, and yeah, he wants to help people and he wants to save the world and save New York and all of that stuff, but also he is at school and needs to pass and needs to get into college and all of those different things. And so I just like the way that Spidey navigates all of that. I think that's really cool.
And for media, there have been several animated series over several decades. So many cartoons, really. Spider-Man kind of found his feet there. There was a Japanese live-action series. There were 3 movies with Tobey Maguire, 2 movies with Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland has had 3 of his own movies in the MCU, and also appeared in additional movies as Spider-Man in the MCU. There have also been a few animated movies and literally thousands of various comic book issues, and also a Broadway musical, because why not?
Yup. Just to name a few. Also, there are a couple books specific to Miles Morales. So Miles Morales Spider-Man and Miles Morales Suspended, which is the sequel, both by Jason Reynolds.
Awesome. And as we think about other themes that tie in with this whole with great power comes great responsibility, as you were talking about Njinga Mbandi, I was struck by the thought that colonialism is really sort of the opposite of with great power comes great responsibility. Like, that's with great power comes great possibility to totally screw over your responsibilities. That is how not to be Spider-Man, basically.
Yeah, it's the anti-Spider-Man.
Spider-Man would be so disappointed in you, I'm just saying. So.
It's true.
And so would Uncle Ben.
Yep. Yeah, colonialism as the anti-Spider-Man. Mm-hmm. I like that. Yeah, I think it's really accurate. I've also been, like, picturing Spider-Man as fighting with Njinga Mbandi. Mm-hmm. Trying to, and so, like, all of these webs in the midst of, like, setting traps and stuff in Angola. That's fantastic. Yeah. I think also there's a sense of thinking about collateral damage that happens that I think Spider-Man tends to, like, the collateral damage happens and then Spider-Man has to wrestle with it, right?
Yeah.
Uncle Ben is killed in the Tobey Maguire ones by a thief who Tobey Maguire lets go.
Yeah.
And doesn't try and stop, and that's who kills Uncle Ben. And then he has to wrestle with the ramifications of his inaction and how that played out. And I think for Njinga Mbandi, the ramifications of, she saved all of these people, all of her people, and pushed back against colonization. And also, almost 200,000 people were enslaved because of her.
Right. I think there's a practicality aspect of people who are shoved into great power and great responsibility that you don't find with people who are, like, naturally born into it. And we don't get this quite as much with Daniel because he's such a legendary figure that we don't hear the practical aspects of his stories. But with both Peter Parker and Njinga Mbandi, they have to have trade-offs all the time. They have to make practical decisions of, this is how much I can do, I don't have enough power to do that much. That kind of thing.
Yeah, it is a reminder, I think, and we get this with King and with so many others. Our heroes are not perfect. Yeah. They live in the real world and have to make decisions from the real world and navigate that and negotiate with their own conscience how they navigate that, right?
Yeah. And even with Daniel, he can save himself, his friends can save themselves, but he's not a story of saving the whole Jewish people, like Esther, you know.
Yep, yeah.
Even if you have power, that doesn't mean you have all the power.
Yeah.
Even if you have superpowers, that doesn't mean you can fix everything.
It's true, yeah. And now, for our Muppets Moment. Our question, as it is every episode this season, is which Muppet would you cast for which hero? Kate.
I suppose since there is a Spider Pig, I am drawn to the idea of Miss Piggy's cousins as various spiders from the Spider-Verse. But I also have to admit that
I was thinking that too.
I was thinking about Team Red and their personality as a superhero team-up and how, like, practical and jaded they are, and I am struck by how fabulous of a Muppet movie it could be if they had to team up with Gonzo the Great. And Gonzo's optimism and cheerfulness and insistence on ridiculousness, like, Deadpool would love that, and Daredevil would be so completely at sea, and Spider-Man would be having the time of his life. Like, I would love that so much. So
I love that. I love that.
And the four of them would bounce off each other so beautifully.
Yeah. I was also thinking about Spider-Pig and Miss Piggy, but yeah, I like the Team Red and Gonzo the Great. That's a great one. I think it's hard because Gonzo the Great is just such a natural one, right? Like, Gonzo the Great,
for superheroes,
as Daniel in the Lion's Den, would also be just like a delightful circus act, right? Like the circus act with the lion and the chairs and stuff. Yeah. But I think I could see Kermit in the Lion's Den.
Sure.
Any of the Muppets that are actual, like, animals where I'm like, a lion would normally eat you.
Rohloff as a dog, growling slightly at the cat lions.
Yeah.
Like, fine, we're not going to eat each other, but that doesn't mean I have to like you. Why isn't there a cat Muppet?
I mean, in the Muppet Wiki, there are domestic cats, Fido and Fluffy, in, like, Sesame Street. The Doctor Who Muppets type situations. Yeah, there are cats, but yeah, none of them are the main.
Yeah.
Grover has a pet cat.
Oh.
Stunt Cat and the Muppet Christmas Carol. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Muppet Christmas Carol has a couple cats, but
sure.
Shalom Sesame. Oh my gosh. Oh, and then of course the lions. There's a bunch of lions. Lions and tigers, maybe bears. There's a tiger named Butch.
Okay.
And a couple live cats. That's cute. Oscar found Tiny Tim. Oh, that's so cute. I am down a rabbit hole. Anyway. Yes, we could totally do the lions. Muppet Lion. Oh my gosh. Oh. Muppet Lions.
Muppet Lion King.
Muppet Lions.
So does that mean that we have various Sesame Street characters wearing lions' manes as the lions in the Lion Den?
No, there's actual lions. There's 7 lions that come up in the Muppet Wiki.
Sure. That's plenty.
So, that's funny. Yeah, but now I'm trying to figure out if I want Tom Holland or more of a Miles Morales Daniel.
Oh, okay, sure.
Right? Muppet Lions with Spider
I don't
Daniel.
really see Tom Holland interpreting dreams. That does not strike me as his...
No, I'm mostly thinking of the Lion's Den part.
Yeah.
And less the, like, interpretation of dreams. I could see Miles Morales doing it, though, so maybe I'll do Miles Morales.
Okay.
That's my ultimate casting, I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us. Our theme music was by Rachel Meyer-Laughlin, Muppets music was by Brenda Boss, and seasonal artwork was by Pace Warfield. Catch us next time when we'll dive into Malala Yousafzai with our special guest Lamia H., author of Hijab Butch Blues. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and Blue Sky at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut episodes, merch discounts, movie commentaries, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. Starting at just $5 per month, it's cheaper than a roll of film to fund your college endeavors, Peter Parker.
Yeah, to be fair, it does seem a little unlikely that you'd be able to shoot enough freelance pictures of Spider-Man to fund a whole college education in New York City now.
Yeah. I mean, it was decades ago, but yeah.
Also, let us know on Blue Sky, Facebook, or Twitter which Muppets you would cast for our heroes in today's episode.
As the ancient Christians said, Pax Vobiscum.